67-year-old trucker John Monroe was days away from retirement when the Army called with a mission no one else could handle. One last haul, an Apache helicopter rotor that had to reach its base in time for an overseas operation. But as storms closed in and rivals closed the gap, could John prove that experience still matters when history is on the line? The morning sun rose slowly over the flatlands of Oklahoma, casting shadows across John Monroe's modest farmhouse. He had spent the night sorting through boxes in the garage, photographs of convoys from the 80s, his old Army mechanic patches, and grease-stained logbooks filled with a lifetime of miles. Retirement was supposed to be simple. A final week of local hauls, a farewell barbecue with old friends, and then quiet days at home. But just as he was sweeping out the garage, the low rumble of a government sedan broke the silence. A dark blue car rolled up the gravel drive, dust clouding behind it. Out stepped Major Daniels, his pressed uniform a sharp contrast to John's faded shirt and work boots. "Mr. Monroe," Daniels said, extending a hand, "we need your help." John squinted, his calloused hands still gripping the broom. He hadn't been called Mr. Monroe in years. Daniels explained. An Apache helicopter rotor, one of only a handful in the country, had to reach a remote Colorado base within 48 hours. Without it, a unit overseas would be grounded, leaving soldiers vulnerable. Every available contractor had declined. The timing was too tight, the route too rough, and the weather too uncertain. "You're saying nobody else will take it," John muttered. "And you're asking a 67-year-old who was planning to quit next week?" Daniels didn't flinch. "We're asking the man who's done the impossible before. The Army remembers." John felt the weight of those words. His last tour as a mechanic had been decades ago, yet the echoes of diesel engines and rotors in desert winds came back instantly. He thought of his wife, gone 10 years now, who used to leave notes in his lunchbox reminding him why he pushed through long nights on the road. He thought of Luke, his son, who had chosen Silicon Valley over small-town Oklahoma, and who never understood why his father clung to a truck cab as if it were sacred. The sensible choice would have been to decline. His back ached more than it used to, his reflexes weren't what they once were. Yet something in Daniel's eyes stirred him. Maybe it was pride, maybe duty, maybe the simple truth that walking away from a challenge like this would gnaw at him forever. He wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "All right, one last ride." 2 hours later, his weathered but reliable Peterbilt 379 rumbled to life. The red paint had dulled with time, chrome dulled by years of storms and sun, but the engine still growled steady, like an old warhorse that refused to quit. Mechanics secured the enormous rotor in a reinforced flatbed trailer, double-checking chains and tie-downs. As John signed the paperwork, Daniels leaned closer. "There's been a schedule change. Deployment moved up. You've got 47 hours. John let out a slow whistle. "Figures." He folded the papers and tucked them into his jacket. The highway stretched wide and empty as he eased onto it, but his mind was anything but calm. The dashboard rattled with familiar vibrations, and hanging from the rearview mirror was a tiny cassette tape keychain, a gift from his wife back when he used to mail recordings from bases overseas. In recent weeks, as he neared retirement, John had become more emotional and nostalgic about his past on the road and what he had accomplished in his life. Without thinking, he popped an old tape into the deck. The voice crackled to life. His own, decades younger, trembling but determined. "Hey Sarah, it's hot as blazes out here. I fixed up another Humvee today, barely made it back from patrol. Don't tell the kid, but I'm scared more than I let on." John gripped the wheel tighter. Memories rushed back. Sandstorms, sirens, the desperate clatter of wrenches in hostile territory. Those nights had never really left him, only quieted under the hum of diesel engines. By late afternoon, he pulled into a way station for a quick inspection. The officer on duty recognized his name on the logbook. "You Monroe? The one who ran emergency fuel lines during Desert Storm?" John chuckled softly. "I guess word sticks longer than tires on asphalt." The man waved him through without delay. "Good luck out there. Looks like a storm's brewing in the Rockies." That was the second warning of the day. A waitress at a diner stop had said the same while pouring his coffee. her hands shaking from exhaustion but her smile unyielding. She slipped the cup onto his table without charging him. "On the house," she whispered. "My brother drove trucks. Said you guys keep the country alive." John tipped his cap in thanks, though his heart was heavy. He knew kindness like that wasn't free. It came from people who were barely holding on themselves. As night fell, the storm warnings echoed louder on the CB. Other truckers talked of mountain passes closing within 24 hours. The chatter mixed with static, but one name cut through it like a knife: Arthur Stokes. John hadn't heard the name in years. Once, Arthur had been a fellow hauler, sharp and ambitious, but bitterness had curdled him. Rumor had it he now worked for a shady subcontractor who took dangerous jobs for quick profit. If Arthur knew about this haul, John suspected trouble. The rotor was strapped tight, but the real weight was invisible. The clock ticking down, the ghosts whispering from the tapes, and the knowledge that one wrong turn could end not just his run, but the mission overseas. Still, he pressed forward, headlights cutting through the dark. One last ride. The night stretched wide and empty as John Monroe crossed into the Texas Panhandle. His Peterbilt's headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the dark, the rhythmic thrum of the engine his only company. On the seat beside him sat a half-empty thermos and the old shoebox of cassette tapes he'd pulled from the garage that morning. He slid another tape into the deck. The voice that came through was his own, 25 years younger, speaking low and quick as though the desert heat still pressed against his skin. "Sarah, I know you're worrying. Today we lost a rotor mid-flight. Pilot limped it back in with barely a whisper of lift. Reminded me why every bolt matters. Tell Luke I'm proud of him, even if he doesn't understand why I'm here." John swallowed hard. Back then Luke had been 12, more interested in tinkering with early computers than hearing about his father's days in sand and sweat. Those words on tape, sent across an ocean, had been his only way to stay tethered to home. By mid-morning, the CB lit up with chatter about the storm front moving faster than forecast. Snow was now predicted to sweep into the Rockies by nightfall, closing passes John needed to cross within the next 18 hours. The time cushion he'd counted on was already crumbling. At a 24-hour truck stop outside Amarillo, John pulled in to refuel. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of rain. Inside the diner, a few drivers nursed their breakfasts. Behind the counter stood a young woman with dark circles under her eyes and a name tag that read Carla. She balanced 2 plates in one hand and a coffee pot in the other. "You headed west?" she asked, topping off his cup. "Colorado Springs," John said. Her eyebrows lifted. "Then you'd better make time. They're already talking chain laws." She hesitated, then slid a wrapped sandwich across the counter. "On me. For the road." John didn't argue. Generosity like that came from people who didn't have much to give. He tipped her more than the sandwich was worth and headed back into the cold. In the cab, he checked his mirrors. A dark Kenworth with blackout rims idled a few rows back. Engine on, lights off. It was still there when he pulled out, and still there an hour later, a steady pinprick on the horizon. Arthur Stokes. John kept his speed even. Arthur wouldn't make a move until the road narrowed or the weather turned in his favor. Arthur hung back, never pressing too close. John knew the man. He wasn't reckless, just patient. He would wait for the road to narrow, for weather or fatigue to tip the odds in his favor. As he merged back onto the interstate, flakes of snow began to streak the windshield. The storm was ahead now, not behind. He called up the weather band. Reports were grim. Winds picking up to 40 miles per hour in the passes, visibility dropping fast. On the CB, truckers swapped advice on alternate routes. That's when an unfamiliar voice broke in with static-laced precision. "Westbound hauler with military load. Your GPS is about to go dark." John's navigation screen flickered once, twice, then went black. He knew instantly this wasn't a coincidence. Arthur had friends with the kind of tech that could blind a truck's tracking in seconds. A thought struck him: Luke. For years, they'd barely spoken except on holidays. But if anyone could guide him through a blackout, it was his son. John hesitated, then thumbed his phone to speed dial. Luke answered on the second ring. "Dad?" What's wrong? Lost GPS storms ahead. And I think Arthur Stokes is behind me. There was a pause. Then Luke's voice steadied. Send me your last known coordinates. I'll get you through. For the next miles, Luke guided him with calm precision, translating radar data into simple instructions. Shift left at the next fork. Hold steady through the crosswinds. To John, it felt like a strange reversal of time. His boy, once the kid who needed rides to school, now the voice keeping him alive on the road. Between the static and Luke's directions, John caught glimpses of his son's world. Mentions of data servers, emergency weather feeds, and how quickly technology could see what a driver's eyes could not. John understood that Luke's life behind screens wasn't weakness. It was another form of vigilance. As the wind picked up and snow swirled under the headlights, John felt something shift. His son was on the other end of the line, not to argue or judge, but to help. And out there in the dark, between the hum of the tires and the hiss of static on the CB, John knew the road ahead was about to test more than his driving skills. Snow whipped across the windshield in sheets, erasing the road until the white blur seemed to swallow everything but the rhythmic growl of the Peterbilt. John Monroe leaned forward, both hands steady on the wheel, listening not just to the storm but to the voice in his ear. Dad, you're drifting north. Luke's voice crackled through the line. Hold your heading southwest, 30 degrees. I've patched into live weather radar. There's a pocket opening near Raton Pass. You can make it if you keep moving. John grunted his acknowledgement, eyes flicking to the useless black screen of his GPS. For the first time, the son who had spent his life in sleek offices and glowing screens was inside the cab with him, guiding him through a storm no machine could see. Behind him, the headlights he'd been watching all day were still there. Arthur Stokes' rig, ghosting in and out of the snow like a predator waiting for the stumble. Hours later, cresting the pass, the steering developed a faint shimmy, an uneven tremor that crawled up through the column. Not catastrophic, not yet, but wrong. With Arthur's headlights needling his mirrors, stopping wasn't an option. Luke, John said, keeping his voice level as the wind shoved at the trailer. I'm feeling play in the steering. Copy. There's a full-service plaza 20 minutes ahead, Luke replied. Lights, cameras, people. If you can baby it there, engine brake, no sudden inputs, you'll have cover. John dropped his speed, let the engine brake do the heavy work, and kept his hands calm on the wheel. The rotor thumped once as a gust hit, chains answering with a chorus of metal. Arthur edged closer, probing, then hung back. The traffic and the fresh salt on the lanes made any hit and run risky. The storm thinned to a milky haze. Fluorescent lights appeared in the distance. Fuel islands, a low garage, a handful of rigs angled in the lot. They burst into the rest stop lot, air brakes hissing, snow spraying across the asphalt. Arthur skidded to a stop at the edge of the lot, lurking like a shadow that didn't want a witness. With cameras overhead, troopers on patrol, and half a dozen drivers watching, he knew better than to make a move. This wasn't the place to strike, not with so many eyes on him. From the garage, a young mechanic in a ball cap hustled out, name patch reading Tyler, followed by his foreman. The rest stop hummed with quiet resilience. A couple of drivers leaned against their rigs, sipping coffee from paper cups, eyes tracking the snow like men reading an old enemy's moves. Inside the garage, sparks jumped from a welding torch, the smell of diesel thick in the air. This wasn't just a pit stop. It was a sanctuary where strangers became allies by necessity, where a man's word and his wrench still mattered more than any contract. Steering feels loose, John called as he climbed down. No hard turns on the way in. Tyler slid under the nose with a lamp, then popped back up, face serious. Drag link ends on its last legs. If it lets go at speed, you're done. I've got a compatible end and boots. 15 minutes if the bolts behave. John reached for his wallet. Tyler shook his head, half grinning despite the cold. I recognized you from one of my granddad's old trucking magazines, he said. He used to say, that man could get a load through a hurricane if it had to be there. Let's make sure this one does. John crouched beside him, steadying the lamp. How long you been at this? Not long, Tyler admitted, grinning. 3 weeks in. My granddad taught me half of what I know before I even finished high school. Said if I could fix an engine in the dark, I could handle just about anything life threw at me. John nodded slowly. Sounds like he was right. For a brief moment, John felt the weight of years loosen. Maybe the road wouldn't end with him. Maybe the next generation was already waiting to carry it forward. While Tyler and his foreman wrenched, 2 more drivers helped John recheck the chains and binders the wind had worked loose. A state patrol cruiser idled near the pumps, lights off but presence noted. Arthur inched forward, then thought better of it. Too many eyes. With a glare that promised more trouble, he dropped his rig in reverse and disappeared toward the highway. Inside the garage, Tyler and his boss hustled to torque the new drag link, then double-checked John's trailer straps and chains, tightening what the impact and wind had loosened. John accepted a mug of steaming coffee, hands trembling with adrenaline. "You all right, old-timer?" Tyler asked. John managed a weary smile. "Still breathing. That'll have to do." As he leaned against the counter, Luke's voice came through his earpiece again. Quieter now. "Dad, I didn't realize what it was like for you out here. I just assumed." John cut him off gently. "You assumed wrong. But you're here now. That counts." There was no bitterness in their silence. Only the sound of 2 men finally starting to understand each other. Back on the highway, dawn crept over the Rockies, painting the snow pink and gold. The Peterbilt groaned but pressed on, rotor still secure. John's eyelids were heavy, his muscles stiff, but the fire in his chest burned bright. The mission wasn't over. The storm was behind him, the rival still out there, the clock still running down. But he wasn't alone anymore. Not with Luke guiding him, not with Tyler's wrenchwork under the chassis, not with the quiet brotherhood of drivers who kept showing up when it mattered most. And so John rolled on, deeper into Colorado, the weight of history strapped to his trailer, and the whisper of redemption growing louder with every mile. The sun rose pale over the Colorado plains, its light washed out by the haze of the departing storm. John knew this was its last great run. The rotor loomed behind him, strapped tight beneath canvas, every chain clinking in rhythm with the tires on the frozen asphalt. The clock was merciless. Less than 12 hours remained until the helicopter was scheduled to lift off. John calculated the distance, still nearly 200 miles of mountain and plateau. He rubbed his eyes, heavy with sleeplessness, then reached for the thermos Carla had given him back in Amarillo. Cold coffee or not, it would have to do. Luke's voice came steady through the earpiece. "Dad, I've mapped 3 possible approaches to the base. The fastest route cuts through a canyon. But I know that road," John interrupted. "Steep grades, bad shoulders. If it's icy, we're finished. Then the safer route adds an hour you don't have." The silence stretched. John finally muttered, "Sometimes the only way is forward." By midday the storm had lifted, but its aftermath lingered. Jackknifed rigs abandoned on shoulders, guardrails bent where drivers had lost the fight. John steered past them with a mix of caution and defiance. Every wreck was a reminder of what could happen, yet every mile he drove was proof he was still in the fight. But the storm hadn't taken Arthur Stokes out of the picture. As John descended into a long valley, his mirrors caught the familiar glint of blackout rims. The rival had returned, this time with reinforcements, 2 other rigs in convoy. Arthur's voice burst over the CB, smug and venomous. "End of the line, Monroe. Pull over, hand it off, and maybe you drive away breathing." John exhaled slowly. 40 years on the road, Arthur, and you still think it's about stealing another man's load? You'll never get it. The 3 rigs fanned out, hemming him in. John's Peterbilt shuddered under the pressure, the rotor shifting slightly on the trailer. He tapped the mic. "Luke, talk me through this." His son's tone was urgent now. "Dad, there's a service road ahead, narrow, but it leads straight toward the base perimeter. You'll have 1 shot to break free." John downshifted, eyes narrowing. He'd trusted worse odds before. He floored it. The Peterbilt roared like a beast awakened, turbo screaming as the old rig lunged forward. Arthur's lead truck swerved to block him, but John clipped his trailer, sparks showering the frozen road. In the chaos, John veered hard right, slamming through a flimsy fence and onto the narrow service road. Snow sprayed in arcs from his tires as the Peterbilt bounced on uneven ground. The rival rigs tried to follow but couldn't match the angle. Only Arthur stuck close, his headlights burning into John's mirrors like the eyes of a predator refusing to quit. For 5 brutal miles they battled. Arthur rammed from behind, trying to shake the rotor loose, while John fought to keep the rig steady. Chains groaned, the trailer wobbled, but somehow the old truck held. Then, ahead, floodlights pierced the dusk. The perimeter of the base. Soldiers were already moving, waving him in. Arthur tried one last strike, gunning his engine for a final shove. John braked hard, letting the rival lunge past, and Arthur's Kenworth skidded sideways, sliding into a ditch with a metallic roar. John didn't look back. The silence after the crash was almost violent in itself. For the first time in hours, John could hear nothing but the labored breath in his chest and the steady pound of the Peterbilt's engine. The rival's lights vanished into the dark, swallowed by snow and ditch mud. He tightened his grip on the wheel, knowing there was no time to savor the victory. The mission wasn't won by beating Arthur. It would only be won when the rotor spun above a battlefield thousands of miles away. When he finally rolled through the gates, the base erupted in motion. Mechanics rushed to unchain the rotor, forklifts swarming like ants around honey. Within minutes, the massive part was hoisted toward the waiting Apache. John slumped in his seat, every muscle trembling, breath fogging the cab. But then he noticed the crowd gathering. Soldiers, mechanics, even truckers he hadn't seen in years. Some had traveled cross-country after hearing whispers that John Monroe's last haul was underway. A retired driver in a wheelchair raised 2 fingers in salute. A young recruit, grease smeared on his face, watched in amazement. John climbed down slowly, knees stiff, heart heavier than the rotor he'd delivered. He wasn't used to applause. His life had been about miles and machinery, not glory. Yet here they were, cheering not just the delivery but the years he'd carried America on his shoulders. And then he saw him. Luke stood at the edge of the crowd, phone still in hand, eyes bright in the floodlights. For a moment John thought it was a mirage, exhaustion tricking him. But then his son stepped forward. "You did it!" His jaw tight, eyes glistening with things unsaid. "I spent years thinking your work was just endless miles for nothing. Tonight I realized every mile meant someone else could sleep safer. I never gave you credit for that." His voice cracked. "I should have." John shook his head. "We did. I wouldn't have made it without you." The 2 men regarded each other in silence, words unnecessary. The gulf between them, years of resentment, misunderstanding, and distance, seemed smaller now, bridged by asphalt, snow, and a final haul that demanded both of them. As the Apache lifted into the night sky, rotor spinning with the part he had delivered, John felt a strange lightness. His career had ended not in quiet obscurity but in service, in defiance, in history. Luke rested a hand on his shoulder. "So what now? Retirement?" John let out a tired laugh. "For once, I think I've earned it." But he knew retirement would never mean idleness. There were stories to share, young drivers to mentor, a son to finally know. His days of hauling freight might be over, but his journey wasn't done. As he walked away from the truck, the applause still ringing in his ears, John realized this wasn't just the end of a road. It was the beginning of something new. One last haul and it had made history. This story makes us reflect on the strength of those who keep the wheels of our world turning, often unnoticed, but never unimportant. If you were in John Monroe's shoes, would you take that one last job, knowing it might be your hardest? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you felt inspired by this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more powerful stories.